All right, Dan, here we are. We're out in California.
Yes.
Bit of a mobile studio. This is not what you're accustomed to seeing if you're watching our YouTube videos. We generally aspire for a little more, but this is what you got to do when you're on the road.
This is what you have to do when you're on your road, when we have Georgia TCU to talk about, or TCU Georgia. Depending on your perspective, yes, this is our little mobile setup where we're staying, and we did a preview episode that you can find on the podcast feed, but we didn't have video for that, so we wanted to do something for the YouTube channel.
Right.
And we've got an incredible matchup. We are in my brother's childhood bedroom, as you can see, all sorts of stuff here. Let's talk Dawgs and Frogs.
Dawgs and Frogs. The point spread at time of recording is 12.5. The over-under is 63. If you listen to the preview podcast, as Dan said, maybe you heard a little bit about how we're thinking and feeling about this game, but why don't we start off on the TCU side?
Yes.
Dan, as you look at TCU, obviously giant killers in a sense. They knocked off Michigan in a pretty big upset a week ago. Now they've got a bigger one in front of them against the defending champions in Georgia. A big a topic of conversation as we were driving around doing our taco tour preview was, what does TCU need to do to stay in this game? Right?
Yeah.
Georgia has worn down many an opponent. TCU finds itself in a unique situation being in this game, but it doesn't necessarily on the surface appear as if that's a great matchup for them.
Right. Georgia's not a great matchup for many teams.
Correct.
The narrative, and I think for understandable reason, is how does TCU upset Georgia? How can TCU possibly win this game? Little old TCU. And I find myself going back and forth, not about who's going to win the game, but just about how to understand TCU, because it's easy to say, look, they play down to opponents mid-year. It's a first-year coach. This is a team learning how to win, and winning is better than losing, as we all know. And so, yes, they needed that fire drill against Baylor. Yes, they only scored 17 points, but held down Texas in that win with a lot of eyes on them. And yes, they lost to Kansas State. And so they are, I believe, 13-1. So giant killing may be appropriate considering what Georgia's done recently, but they were also a regular season undefeated Power 5 team. In their own way, they themselves are unexpected giants. So the best thing I can say about TCU, and I mean this sincerely, is they play to the moment, right? Sometimes they play down to teams, but we saw that against Michigan. They get the pick sixes. Now people look at that as like, oh, well, they needed 2 pick sixes to beat Michigan. Like, they got 2 pick sixes. That's incredible. That means they have opportunistic defensive players who can jump passing lanes and take advantage of opportunities. Everybody would be fortunate to have 2 pick sixes. So I look at that as a positive thing, even though you can make the case that like Michigan had the opportunities. TCU is better at taking advantage of opportunities than the number 2 team in the country. And so the case for TCU winning this game is, 1, they're really good. 2, even though they're really good, they probably need help. And 3, they're good at making their own luck, right? That they're able to generate points in different ways, whether it's the running game, whether it's Max Duggan, whether it's defense or special teams, taking advantage of opportunities. That's what great teams do.
Yeah.
So I would say the way that TCU can beat Georgia is, 1, beat TCU, because that's a really good team to start off. That's a great first step. And 2, we're going to need some explosion plays on offense. We're going to need some sort of breakdown. We're going to need a continuation of perhaps taking advantage of some Georgia passing game defense deficiencies, as we saw exploited by LSU and Ohio State. But really, it's not a like, what kind of miracle does TCU need? It's a question of, is TCU's really good competitive enough with Georgia?
Yeah.
That's the thing that I stay awake thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think my comments around this game are going to echo what we said before the Michigan game. Best defense they've played all year. Check.
Yep.
Can they keep their quarterback upright? Check. Can they stop the opponent's rushing attack? Check. Like, a lot of this stuff carries over from that first game, and obviously, like you said, they made a bit of their own luck in that Michigan game. I think it's key for them to get out to an early lead. If they don't get out to an early lead, I think it's problematic. We found that, through varying instances this past season, even the playoff game, getting up early on a team takes them out of rhythm. It allows you to play to your style. TCU's style this season has been giving the game back a little bit in the fourth quarter, but you'd still much rather be up than down. And so the fact that they can get out early on a team, I think, takes teams out of rhythm. That could be beneficial if they find themselves in that situation. I'm curious to see how Georgia fares against the 3-3-5, more of a 3-2-6 defense that TCU likes to run. It's been one of the popular talking points in the build-up to this matchup, but it's not something it's not something a whole lot of teams around college football have a whole lot of experience against.
Right.
And again, if you go back and listen to the preview podcast, we had Mike Golick Jr. on. He talked about some of the challenges just as an offensive line going up against that front. They did a really good job getting into some of those half spaces and knocking down the Michigan rushing attack. So if they're able to provide that level of resistance against Georgia, that's another avenue to take them out of their game. The problem is that Georgia was also taken a bit out of its rhythm against Ohio State, and Stetson Bennett answered the moment. Stetson Bennett threw for nearly 400 yards and proved that even if it's not working on the ground, we can still do it through the air. I feel like Michigan is just not as well-rounded as Georgia is, and that's apparent at this point. So even if Georgia is taken out of its game, out of its rhythm, they still have multiple ways that they can beat you. But I think if I'm TCU, I want to get out early. I want to try and create some havoc with that 3-3-5 defense. And, the other thing is find ways to get Max Duggan on the run. Create time for him. I think the Georgia defensive front's going to have a lot more success getting home than Michigan did. And so you need to put Max Duggan on the run. You need to move the pocket a little bit, buy some time. Hopefully a guy like a Quintin Johnston, somebody can get open downfield to create plays in space.
So let's stick with that theme, though. Let's stick with Georgia having the ball, what your previous point with the confusion of TCU's defense, okay? Are you confident in Georgia's offense implicitly? So what I mean by that is Georgia struggled at times by their standards, offensively. You look at the last two times they played in this game. A lot of struggles early on offense, right? That Stetson Bennett needed to be kind of bulletproof and perfect late in the fourth because really struggled against Alabama. Really struggled against, Georgia struggled against Alabama, different team back in 2017-18 in the first half. And that's still a Kirby Smart team. And you remember, obviously, Alabama making the move from Jalen Hurts to Tua to win that game. But there was sluggishness both times Georgia has been in this spot recently. And so Georgia's going to throw everything at the wall, right? It's a national championship. TCU is going to throw everything at the wall in this national championship. But as we know, Ladd McConkey beat up. Darnell Washington, a big part of this offense, their second tight end with Brock Bowers, beat up in this game. And so they get a little bit healthier at receiver. We saw A.D. Mitchell make that incredible touchdown catch in the corner of the end zone. We saw Arian Smith come out and make plays. But it seems that beyond Brock Bowers and now Ladd McConkey being beat up, there's not a ton to count on in terms of pass catching, right? There's not that gravitational pull, which Georgia has won a ton without.
Sure.
And there's not, I think Kenny McIntosh is really good as an all-purpose guy, but there's no specific situational guy where I'm like, all right, the chips are at the middle of the table, whatever. They're going to this guy, right? That they have this go-to situation. We'll see. Brock Bowers should be healthier. I think he was sick for the semi matchup, but played. So Brock Bowers is that answer. I just wonder if it does get to be a high scoring situation, if Georgia can do this 2 weeks in a row.
Yeah, and I think it's imperative for Georgia to establish their rushing game, their ground game, right? If they're able to run to the same effect that they have most of the season, the game is over.
Oh yeah,
the game is over. Georgia likes to milk out long drives. They don't have a ton of possession, a ton of drives, I should say, but they like to have
they make their drives
control
count,
the ball, right? They're very efficient, and so if they're able to get it going on the ground, I think that spells doom in some sense for TCU. But if they're not able to get it going on the ground, that's when it gets interesting.
Yeah,
and that's when I think Kirby Smart has to turn it over to Brock Bowers, but to Stetson Bennett, right, to see what he can do. He obviously has answered the call, in pretty much every situation they've needed him to since the end of last season. But to your point of winter wonders, as we call them on our show, who are the guys, who are the go-to guys outside of Brock Bowers? I don't know. I just have confidence in Georgia at this point that they've been there before.
Right.
They've conducted themselves very professionally in these types of situations before. They've been here, they've done that, and I don't know. I feel like on the grandest stage like this, the odds are ever in Georgia's favor. They will find a way to get it done with Kirby Smart.
All right, other side of the ball. TCU has the ball. Clearly the more exciting, if not more efficient offense because of their big playability that Georgia doesn't necessarily possess in that same way. Georgia's been a more successful program over the last few years doing what they do. But TCU with the ball, with their own Heisman finalist quarterback in Max Duggan, they've met the moment. They win their close games late. They're able to generate explosion plays. They have the best receiver in this game in Quintin Johnston. They're a little bit beat up on offense in terms of the skill guys, with Kendre Miller getting hurt against Michigan. Are there concerns to you about TCU's offense beyond Georgia's defense can be very, very good despite some deficiencies against Ohio State?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too concerned about the TCU offense because they've gotten it done all year.
Yep.
They've found ways to, as you said, create
Other
their
than
own
that
luck.
Texas game.
Other than the Texas game.
Yeah.
They've found ways pretty consistently to create their own luck. It is a big play offense.
Yeah.
It is a big play offense. So if there is any concern on my end, it's not necessarily scheme. It's not necessarily in terms of players. It's if Georgia is able to put a cap on those big plays, if they're not allowing TCU to get into open spaces, if they're not allowing Quintin Johnston to run for 67 odd yards on his way to a touchdown, that takes a little bit out of that TCU attack, right? If you're forcing them 5 yards, 7 yards, dink and dunks, eventually I think they make a mistake, and that's not going to work out for them in the end. But if they're hitting those big plays, if they're getting 2, 3, 4 40-yard gainers, that very much plays to their favor. So if I'm a Georgia fan, I'm looking for big plays. I'm hoping that the defense is able to contain,
Right.
in some way, shape, or form so that those big explosion plays aren't part of the TCU attack.
Which team can withstand 2 interceptions and win the game?
Probably Georgia.
Interesting. I think it's more TCU.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably make a really strong case for both. TCU is very quick. Again, they're a quick play offense. 2 interceptions isn't necessarily going to kill them because they can hurt you in one play.
Right.
And they could get right back into it. But I also think Georgia, with the style of play, I do believe they'll be able to establish the run.
Okay.
I don't think they're going to have...
Why? After what Michigan was not able to do.
After what Michigan was not able to do, right? I feel like with the benefit of another week of tape and the understanding what TCU is going to do probably to try and knock down this Georgia rushing attack, that will benefit Georgia and Kirby Smart greatly. If you read any of the pregame build-up to this, much of what people have said about TCU and the way that they approach preparation is they're copiers. They're copycats. They'll look to see what worked for another team, and they'll try to duplicate
their own version, yeah.
And so if that's the case, Georgia, I think, can play a little bit of that game as well, looking at what TCU did against Michigan and trying to make adjustments.
Okay, fair enough. See, I think it's TCU because of, we saw a different team, obviously, in that Kansas State game, the long lulls of 3-and-outs and turnovers and mistakes from the TCU offense, and yet right there to win that game.
Yeah.
On a neutral site, K-State obviously is not in the class of Georgia after what we saw with them against Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, but that to me is at least the positive thing with TCU, that they can move the ball quicker than Georgia if they need to. And that's more of their DNA of finding guys deep and letting those deep plays develop. Whereas Georgia is a little bit, not to say that they can't do that, they're just a little bit more methodical and picking on different parts of the field and just keeping the chains moving in a pretty lethal way. I like Georgia here. I think it's a personnel thing to me that when you start getting into this part of the season, games 13, 14, 15 like that, it's whose 2s are better, right? Who's third string guy if a linebacker goes out, right? That there's just so much that hinges on TCU staying healthy and TCU generating certain types of plays and big moments that Georgia can play a B-plus game and win, and TCU just can't. TCU, so in terms of how many, if this game were played 100 times, how many times does TCU play a perfect game? 8 times, 6 times. And so just playing by the numbers, I'm rolling with the team that can play a B-plus game and win a national championship. Now the question is, what do you say, 12.5, 13 points? That's a big number.
It's a big number. I'm on TCU. I was on TCU to cover, and I think I talked myself out of it. I'm on Georgia to win 38-24.
So barely covering.
The point spread opened at about 13.5, 14 points. So I think Georgia wins this one by 2 scores. And I think it comes down to their front seven. I think their front seven far and away is going to be the best defensive unit. Again, I said this a week ago against Michigan. So perhaps it'll be a similar jinx here this week for Georgia. But I really feel confident in their front seven to change this game. Georgia's not necessarily the best team at getting home.
Right.
But I do think the quality of their front seven is better than what Michigan presented
right.
a week ago in the Fiesta Bowl. So I think that factor alone will change the rhythm of the TCU offense. Max Duggan, they're going to have to put him on the move. They're going to have to get him outside of the pocket to create chances for him to throw the ball downfield. But I think Georgia will find a way to mitigate that.
Right.
So I'm on 38-24 in favor of the Dogs. I guess that would technically be the under 63 as well. I'm hopeful that this can be a good game. Even if TCU loses by 2 scores, it doesn't mean it's not a close game.
Right.
This game could be close the full way through, and Georgia could pull a few touchdowns out very quickly down the stretch. So I'm hopeful that we get at least one good half out of this, and that it's a good game down to the wire. I would love nothing more than a close game, but I really feel strongly on Georgia.
Yeah, my gut says 34-20 Dogs, and I hate my gut. I hate it because I want TCU to win this game, because I want novelty in the sport. I want the story to continue. I want this completely bonkers out of nowhere story to continue. How much are you affected or unaffected by the Ohio State game? That Georgia is a good field goal, a tough field goal, 49-yarder at the gun. But does that affect you that Georgia looked, now it's Ohio State and it's similar talent, but vulnerable in ways they haven't in a little bit?
It does, because something that Ohio State did to great effect was run tempo. And they kept Georgia on the field. They didn't allow Georgia to substitute. And that had a pretty strong impact on the game, to say the least. So I would expect that TCU will do something similar. But to that point, if we know it, Kirby Smart knows it as well.
Right.
And they will try to find ways to counteract that. So I'm curious to see how that bears itself out over the course of this game. And I think anytime that Georgia looks vulnerable, it definitely throws more fuel on the fire of, hey, they're beatable.
Yeah.
And TCU coming into this game red hot, all the momentum on their side, basically playing with house money all year long. You don't like to bet against those teams.
Right.
Because you just never know when they're going to pull the rabbit out of the hat.
Nothing to lose.
Right. So that's an advantageous position to be in. And I do think to some extent Ohio State felt a little bit of that as well, sneaking in as a 4 seed, getting another crack at Georgia. It was a good spot for them to be in as well, and they damn near won the game. So, yeah, it does concern me a little bit, but only a little bit. I still feel pretty confident in Georgia's ability.
And we also know that Ohio State, when fully weaponized and operational on offense, are probably the best offense in the country. I worry a little bit about there's both sides of the coin with TCU playing with house money and just why not win a national championship? We're already here.
You don't want to go up against the crazy guy in the fight with nothing to lose.
Right. They have 0 to lose. The thing that worries me a little bit is the been there before element to Georgia. They understand the rhythms of the week leading up. They understand the rhythms of the pregame. They understand, I think Tom Brady's talked about this with Super Bowls, and that's a big advantage he has is, coming out in the first quarter a little more measured, right? Yeah. Because he understands that this takes longer and that takes longer. How to manage butterflies, the humanity of it all. The humanity.
Sure.
That a lot of this Georgia team, even though they were backups last year, some of the guys who have stepped in on defense and were rotation guys last year, they understand the rhythms of this stage, right? And that they'll go up 10-0 early just because of the frog jitters. That this is a stage, even though they beat Michigan on a similar stage last week. The stakes at play here are so foreign to every single person wearing purple on that sideline that it's almost like they let the first quarter and Georgia beat them rather than just Georgia.
Here is the thing, though.
Yeah.
TCU can win this game. I don't believe they will.
Okay.
But they can win this game.
Okay.
If they get out to an early lead, if they can take Georgia out of rhythm, if they can do something with that ground game, or something against that ground game and stop Georgia from establishing it and force Stetson Bennett and Kirby Smart's hand, they can win this game. Okay. There is a pathway for that to happen. So I will not be totally flabbergasted if it does. I will from a story standpoint, and as we look back on the course of the season, how TCU got to this point, that will be, as you posted on Twitter, gobsmacking.
Yes.
But that aside, I still have more confidence in Georgia getting the job done here, 38-24.
I'm with you. If in this situation, and it's different teams, different years, if you have to outline how a team could construct a win against a more talented team, bet with the more talented team.
Usually when you get to this point in the season, the team coming into the national championship, the team that is favored, you already know how they're going to win or how they want to win. The style of play. you understand how they're going to approach things. The TCU side, you're very much constructing that argument.
Right.
You're very much constructing, okay, this is how we could see it conceivably happening. I don't see it happening. I would love for it to happen. So we'll see.
God, we're hedging so like it's an
I'm not
emotional
hedging.
hedge.
I'm all in on Georgia.
I know you're picking, but it's an emotional hedge.
It is emotional. I prefer TCU.
Yeah, same. All right. So look, when we are wrong, grab the bit of this video and edit it and tweet it at Solid Verbal.
That's right.
After you've subscribed to the YouTube channel, and we will happily eat that delightfully seasoned and basted and sautéed crow.
We will.
All right.
We've done it before. We'll do it again. Make sure that you hit subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'll be doing some live stuff, I'm sure, in and around the national championship, Monday night, January the 9th. In the meantime, stay solid.
Peace.